Relax, princess, at this point people might think I'm proposing. Ethan Carter meant it as a joke, the kind of quiet line you toss into the air to keep a room from collapsing under its own awkward silence. But the moment the words left his mouth, the entire crystal hall seemed to stop breathing. The sound of a ceremonial ring slipping from a velvet pedestal echoed across the chamber like a bell struck underwater, thin and haunting, and suddenly 100 alien eyes turned toward him. Ethan instantly regretted everything. The Palace of Veiled Dominion had looked impressive when he first walked in an hour earlier. All towering columns of translucent crystal and floating banners glowing with soft violet light. But standing there now beneath a ceiling that arched nearly 70 feet above him, surrounded by diplomats, nobles, and armored royal guards, the place felt less like a palace and more like the center of a very expensive mistake. He was not supposed to be here. Engineers from Earth did not belong in royal ceremonies. Ethan was just the unlucky communications technician who had been called up from the embassy maintenance deck to fix a translation relay that had decided to die 10 minutes before the most important diplomatic ritual of the year. He had expected wires, circuit panels, maybe a frustrated assistant shouting about schedules. What he had not expected was to end up standing less than 3 feet away from the most powerful woman in an entire star system. Princess Lysera Vale stood perfectly still beside him, tall and composed, her skin a deep sapphire blue that reflected the pale palace lights like polished glass. A delicate crown of silver filaments rested against her dark hair, and the long ceremonial cloak draped from her shoulders shimmered like starlight drifting through water. Even Ethan, who had spent the last 12 minutes trying very hard not to stare at alien royalty, had to admit she looked less like a person and more like something carved out of the night sky. Moments earlier the ceremony had stalled when a malfunctioning translator projected the wrong phrase into the chamber, creating a wave of murmurs among the assembled nobles. Ethan had leaned in to reset the device, whispered a quick apology to the princess for the technical delay, and then, trying to lighten the tension in the air, delivered the worst line of his life. Now the silence stretched so long that Ethan could hear the soft hum of hovering lanterns drifting above the marble floor. Several of the royal guards had straightened. A few diplomats looked confused. One elderly court advisor stared at Ethan like a man watching a meteor approach in slow motion. Ethan opened his mouth, ready to laugh it off and explain that humans had this thing called sarcasm. But before he could speak, Princess Lysera slowly turned her head toward him. Her golden eyes studied his face with calm, almost scientific attention, as if she were measuring something invisible. Then, with absolute composure and a voice clear enough to carry across the entire hall, she said 4 words that made Ethan's stomach drop straight through the polished floor. "I agree to be yours." For half a second no one moved. Then the chamber exploded into motion. Robes rustled. Guards shifted position. Several nobles gasped openly. And one by one, like dominoes tipping across the marble floor, the royal court began to kneel. The first sound Ethan Carter noticed was not the whispering nobles or the shifting boots of royal guards, but the quiet, synchronized movement of fabric as half the court slowly lowered themselves to one knee. It happened in a ripple that spread across the polished crystal floor like a wave rolling across glass. Ethan blinked once, then twice, convinced his brain had temporarily stopped translating reality. A minute ago he had been standing beside a malfunctioning translation console with a toolkit in one hand and a screwdriver tucked behind his ear. Now an entire alien royal court appeared to be kneeling because of something he had said. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again before any words managed to escape. This cannot possibly be happening. Princess Lysera Vale did not move. She stood exactly where she had been before, tall and calm, the long silver threads of her ceremonial cloak catching the violet light drifting from the floating lanterns above. Up close Ethan could see the subtle details he had missed earlier, the faint luminous patterns along her sapphire blue skin, the precise symmetry of her crown, the steady focus in her golden eyes. She looked less surprised than anyone else in the room, which made Ethan feel even more nervous. Around them the chamber filled with hushed voices. Several advisors whispered urgently to one another. A pair of tall guards in mirrored armor stepped forward and then froze again, as if uncertain whether they were supposed to intervene or witness history. Ethan slowly raised both hands in the universal human gesture that meant wait a second. Okay, hold on. Everyone hold on. His voice echoed faintly against the 70-foot ceiling. I think there has been a misunderstanding. A few heads lifted, but nobody stood. Instead, the kneeling nobles remained perfectly still, watching the princess. Ethan leaned slightly closer to Lysera and lowered his voice. Your Highness, I need to explain something. When humans say something like that, we do not always mean it literally. It was just a joke. Something we say to break tension. Lysera regarded him quietly, her gaze moving across his face as if studying a new scientific phenomenon. The translation band resting along Ethan's collar hummed softly as it carried her voice into his language. A joke. She repeated the unfamiliar word carefully, tasting its shape. Ethan nodded quickly. Yes, exactly. A joke. Not a proposal. Not an oath. Just words meant to make people relax. For a long moment, she did not respond. The lantern light reflected across her eyes like distant stars. Then she asked a question so calm and simple that Ethan felt his pulse stumble. Why would your species make humor from sacred vows? Ethan opened his mouth and immediately realized he had no good answer. Behind them, a thin, elderly advisor slowly rose to his feet and cleared his throat. Princess Lysera, the advisor said gently, according to the ceremonial record, your acceptance has already been witnessed by the full court. Protocol requires that the declaration be recognized. Ethan felt the room tilt slightly. Witnessed. Declaration. Protocol. These were not words you wanted connected to something you had said as a joke. He glanced back at the kneeling nobles who were still waiting with patient, almost reverent silence. A slow realization crept up his spine like cold air. The court was not reacting to his joke. They were reacting to her answer. And apparently on this world, when a princess publicly accepted a proposal, even an accidental one, the galaxy had a habit of taking it very seriously. The silence that followed the advisor's words felt heavier than the towering crystal pillars around them. Ethan Carter suddenly became aware of every small detail in the hall, the faint humming of suspended lanterns drifting overhead, the soft friction of ceremonial robes brushing against the polished floor, the quiet breathing of an entire court waiting for something he clearly did not understand. He shifted his weight and felt the small metal tools still clipped to his belt, a reminder that less than 30 minutes earlier he had been crawling behind a translation console fixing a broken signal line. Now an interstellar diplomatic ceremony appeared to be balanced on a sentence he had never meant seriously. Ethan glanced again at the rows of kneeling nobles. Their expressions were calm, almost patient, like witnesses observing the final step of a ritual that had already been decided. None of them looked confused. None of them looked amused. If anything, they looked respectful. That was the part that made Ethan's pulse climb faster. Respect was not the reaction people gave to sarcasm. Slowly he leaned closer to Princess Lysera, lowering his voice just enough to avoid carrying across the hall. I really need you to help me here, he whispered carefully. On Earth, when someone says something like that, it is just a figure of speech. We use humor to reduce tension. Nobody would treat it as an actual marriage proposal. Lysera did not immediately answer. Instead, she lifted her gaze across the chamber where the court remained perfectly still, then back to Ethan. Up close, he noticed something new in her expression. It was not confusion. It was consideration. The kind of thoughtful focus someone used when examining a complicated puzzle. When she spoke, her tone remained steady and composed. In the Dominion language, spoken vows given before witnesses carry legal and ceremonial meaning. Your words were clear. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Right. Of course they were. Because he had spoken English while standing beside the royal translation system that automatically converted every word into the Dominion ceremonial dialect and projected it through the chamber speakers. Which meant that when he joked about proposing, the entire hall had heard a perfectly formal statement of intent. That realization settled in his chest with the uncomfortable weight of gravity. Okay, Ethan muttered quietly to himself. That is not great. He rubbed the back of his neck, thinking as fast as his brain could manage. There had to be a way to clarify this before it turned into something even bigger. Humans had misunderstandings all the time. A quick explanation, maybe a polite apology, and everyone could laugh it off. At least that was how it worked back home. He straightened slightly and looked toward the elderly advisor who had spoken earlier. Sir, Ethan began cautiously, I believe this situation is the result of a translation misunderstanding. I meant no disrespect to the princess or to your traditions. I simply attempted humor. For a brief moment, the advisor studied him in thoughtful silence. Then the old alien inclined his head a fraction of an inch. The court recognizes intent, he said slowly. However, ceremonial law recognizes acceptance. Ethan felt his stomach tighten again. Because at that exact moment Princess Lysera spoke softly beside him, her voice calm and certain enough to carry through the hall without raising in volume. My acceptance was not a misunderstanding. The words settled over the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. My acceptance was not a misunderstanding. For a heartbeat, Ethan Carter thought the translation band on his collar had malfunctioned again. He turned slowly toward Princess Lysera, certain he must have heard wrong, but the calm certainty in her golden eyes told him the device had translated her perfectly. She meant exactly what she had said. Around them the court remained kneeling, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense quiet of confusion. It was the quiet of expectation. Ethan felt the strange pressure of hundreds of witnesses waiting for a moment that had somehow become historic. He lowered his voice again, careful not to let it echo through the hall. Your Highness, he said slowly, I need to be absolutely sure we understand each other. I was joking. Completely joking. Humans do that when situations get uncomfortable. It was not a proposal. Lysera studied him with the same composed curiosity she had shown since the beginning of the ceremony. The lantern light above them reflected in the smooth sapphire tone of her skin and along the delicate silver crown resting in her dark hair. When she spoke again, her voice remained gentle but unwavering. I am aware that you intended humor. Ethan blinked. That was not the answer he expected. If she knew he was joking, then the entire court kneeling behind him made even less sense. He rubbed a hand across his face, trying to keep his thoughts organized. Then why would you accept it? The question left his mouth before he had time to soften it. A faint murmur moved through the far edges of the chamber, but quickly faded again. Lysera did not appear offended. Instead, she lifted her gaze briefly toward the long rows of advisors, diplomats, and nobles who filled the hall, then returned her attention to Ethan. Because your words created a choice, she said quietly. Ethan frowned. A choice. The translation band repeated the phrase exactly, but it still did not clarify anything. Lysera continued in the same calm tone. In the Dominion Court, my future has been discussed, negotiated, and arranged since I was old enough to understand language. Alliances are formed through marriage. Political stability depends upon it. Many individuals in this room have spent years deciding which union would best benefit the empire. Ethan followed her gaze across the kneeling court. Suddenly the ceremony around them made a different kind of sense. The elaborate hall, the ceremonial rings, the dozens of watching nobles. This had not simply been a diplomatic reception. It had been something far more structured, something planned. Lysera looked back at him. Until a few moments ago, every outcome in this room had already been predicted. Every conversation had been rehearsed. Every decision belonged to someone else. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle slowly in his chest. Then she added softly, but your statement was not arranged. It was spontaneous, uncalculated. The first unscripted proposal anyone has ever spoken to me. Ethan stared at her for several seconds while his brain attempted to catch up with reality. You accepted a marriage proposal, he said carefully, because it was unexpected. Lysera's lips curved almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile, but something warmer than the calm expression she had worn until now. I accepted because for the first time in this hall someone spoke to me as a person instead of a political agreement. The quiet words hung between them longer than Ethan expected. Someone spoke to me as a person instead of a political agreement. Ethan Carter felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with ceremony or protocol. For the first time since the kneeling had begun, he stopped thinking like an engineer trying to fix a malfunction and started listening like a human being standing 3 feet away from someone whose entire life had apparently been scheduled by other people. He looked again at the rows of nobles still kneeling across the crystal floor. Their faces were patient, disciplined, waiting for a signal from the princess. They were not shocked anymore. They were observing, studying, measuring the moment the way historians watch a turning point unfold. Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. On Earth, conversations about marriage usually happened over dinner or after months of dating, not under 70-foot ceilings surrounded by royal witnesses and translation systems broadcasting every word. Your Highness, he said quietly, I need to be honest with you. Back home, when someone says something like that, it usually comes after knowing each other for a long time. People meet, they talk, they argue about movies, they figure out if they can stand living in the same house. Then maybe they talk about marriage. Lysra listened carefully, the calm curiosity in her expression unchanged. Ethan continued, trying to keep his tone respectful while still being clear. I have known you for about 4 minutes. Technically it has been closer to 7, Lysra replied softly. Ethan blinked once. That was not the correction he expected. He almost laughed before remembering they were standing in the middle of an imperial court. 7 minutes, he repeated, nodding slowly. Right. That does not make the situation less surprising. For the first time, a faint hint of amusement flickered across Lysra's eyes. The small shift was subtle but unmistakable. It was the expression of someone who had spent most of her life in carefully controlled conversations and had just encountered a person who refused to follow the script. The elderly advisor near the front of the court cleared his throat gently. Princess Lysra, he said with diplomatic patience, the ceremonial chamber awaits your instruction. Ethan followed the advisor's gaze and suddenly noticed something he had missed earlier. The ring that had fallen during the ceremony still rested on the polished floor several feet away, its silver band catching the lantern light like a small star. It had probably been part of the planned ritual, the ritual that Ethan had accidentally interrupted. Lysra looked toward the ring for a moment, then back at Ethan. The court believes a declaration has occurred, she said calmly. Ethan nodded slowly. Yes, I am beginning to understand that part. What he did not understand was why she seemed so calm about it. Anyone in his position would be panicking by now. Yet the princess appeared thoughtful instead of alarmed. After a moment, she asked quietly, Ethan Carter, do humans always retreat from their own words so quickly? Ethan hesitated. That question landed closer to his conscience than he expected. Not always, he admitted. Sometimes we say things without thinking. Sometimes we mean them more than we realize. Lysra studied him carefully, as if that answer mattered far more than the ceremony unfolding around them. Then she said something that made Ethan's pulse skip again. Then perhaps the court should hear whether your words were truly only humor. For several seconds, Ethan Carter simply stared at Princess Lysra, as if the laws of gravity had quietly changed without informing him. Around them, the vast chamber remained still, the kneeling nobles waiting with the calm patience of people who had witnessed centuries of ceremony and knew that important decisions often arrived slowly. The floating lanterns drifted overhead in gentle circles, casting soft reflections across the crystal columns and the polished floor where the fallen ceremonial ring still glimmered a few feet away. Ethan could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on him now. A minute ago, the attention had belonged to the princess. Now it had shifted entirely to the human engineer who had accidentally spoken a sentence that apparently carried the weight of a royal vow. He cleared his throat quietly, buying himself a moment to think. Back on Earth, he had negotiated contracts with stubborn suppliers, explained technical failures to frustrated supervisors, and once talked his way out of a parking ticket in downtown Chicago. None of those experiences had prepared him for addressing an interstellar royal court about an accidental proposal. He took a slow breath and looked at Lysra again. Her posture had not changed. She stood tall and composed, her silver crown catching the lantern light, while those golden eyes watched him with a steady calm that somehow made the situation feel even more serious. She was not pressuring him. She was simply waiting for the truth. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again, a small human habit he always fell back on when his thoughts were racing. When humans joke, he began carefully, we usually do it because the moment feels tense or awkward. Humor lets everyone breathe again. Nobody expects the words to become official decisions. Several advisors exchanged quiet looks, clearly processing the explanation through their translation bands. Ethan continued, speaking slowly so the translation system would not distort his meaning. Where I come from, marriage is a personal choice between two people. It happens after trust grows over time. People learn who the other person really is. It is not something decided in the middle of a crowded room with diplomats watching. He paused, aware that the description sounded almost childish compared to the enormous traditions surrounding them. Still, he forced himself to finish the thought honestly. That is why I said it as a joke. Because the situation felt overwhelming and humor is how humans deal with that. For a moment the hall remained quiet except for the faint hum of the lanterns. Then the elderly advisor spoke again, his voice respectful but thoughtful. Your explanation is understood, Ethan Carter of Earth. However, the declaration was heard clearly by the court, and the princess responded before witnesses. Under Dominion ceremonial law, such an exchange carries meaning beyond the speaker's intent. Ethan sighed softly. Yes, he said, I was afraid you might say that. He looked again at Lysera. Something about her expression had changed slightly, though it was difficult to describe. She still appeared calm, but now there was a trace of curiosity behind the composure, as if she were observing not only his words but the way he struggled to balance honesty with respect. Ethan straightened a little, realizing there was one more thing he needed to say. Princess Lysera, he said quietly, if my words placed you in a difficult position with your court, then I sincerely apologize. That was never my intention. Lysera studied him for several seconds before answering. You have placed me in a position that has never existed before, she said calmly. Ethan blinked. That sounds complicated. It is new, Lysera replied. Then she turned slightly toward the court and spoke clearly enough for the entire chamber to hear. The human has spoken truthfully about his intent. However, the court must now consider something else. Ethan felt the room shift again, as if the entire palace had leaned forward to listen. Lysera's gaze returned to him, and she finished the sentence with quiet certainty. Whether intent or accident, the first choice offered to me in this hall came from him. The chamber did not erupt into noise the way Ethan Carter expected. Instead, the reaction moved through the court like a slow shifting tide. Some nobles exchanged careful glances. Others remained perfectly still, studying the princess with the disciplined attention of people who understood that history sometimes changed direction without warning. The floating lanterns above drifted lazily through the air currents near the 70-foot ceiling, their soft violet light reflecting across the crystal pillars and the polished floor. Ethan suddenly became aware that the silence had turned heavier again. Princess Lysera's final words still echoed faintly through the chamber. The first choice offered to me in this hall came from him. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to process the situation without letting the pressure show on his face. He had walked into the palace expecting a broken translation console and maybe a mildly irritated diplomat. Now an entire empire appeared to be reconsidering its traditions because of something he had said while trying to lighten the mood. He leaned slightly closer to Lysera and lowered his voice again. I have to admit, he murmured carefully, this is the most intense reaction anyone has ever had to one of my jokes. Lysera turned her head just enough to look at him directly. For a moment the seriousness in her golden eyes softened again, almost like the beginning of amusement. In your culture humor carries little consequence, she replied quietly. In mine words spoken before witnesses shape the future. Ethan nodded slowly. That difference is becoming extremely clear. Across the chamber the elderly advisor stepped forward a few paces. The long folds of his ceremonial robes brushed quietly across the crystal floor as he addressed the court. The human's statement of intent may not have been deliberate, he said thoughtfully, but the princess has confirmed that her acceptance was genuine. The advisors behind him exchanged murmurs that rolled softly through the chamber like distant wind. Ethan watched the discussion unfold with a mixture of fascination and disbelief. He had spent years solving technical problems where every issue could be traced to a faulty circuit or a damaged line of code. This was something entirely different. Here the problem was tradition, expectation, and the unpredictable nature of human conversation. Lysera observed the advisors for a moment before speaking again, her voice calm, but carrying easily across the hall. The court has spent years discussing which alliance would strengthen the Dominion. Those discussions assumed that my role was to accept whichever arrangement served the Empire best. She paused briefly, then added something that caused several nobles to shift where they knelt. But no one asked what I would choose if given the opportunity. Ethan glanced at her again, surprised by the quiet conviction in her voice. Until tonight, every path before me had already been decided. Her gaze moved briefly across the gathered court, then returned to Ethan. You did not know our customs, she continued softly. Yet you spoke freely, without calculation, without expectation. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. To be fair, he said quietly, If I had known this was a marriage ceremony, I probably would have chosen a different joke. That time Lysera's lips curved into a small, unmistakable smile. The expression lasted only a second before her composure returned, but Ethan noticed it. The advisors continued murmuring among themselves, clearly uncertain how to interpret the situation. After a moment, the elderly advisor turned again toward the princess. The court recognizes the unusual nature of this moment, he said carefully. Tradition offers no clear precedent. Lysera inclined her head slightly. Then perhaps it is time for the Dominion to witness something new. The words settled over the court like a ripple spreading through still water. Then perhaps it is time for the Dominion to witness something new. For a moment nobody moved. The kneeling nobles remained frozen in respectful silence, the advisors exchanging quiet glances as if measuring the weight of a decision that had never existed in their long histories. Ethan Carter shifted slightly beside the princess, feeling the strange pressure of standing in the center of a room that had suddenly become far more important than he had ever intended. The floating lanterns drifted slowly above them, their pale violet glow reflecting across the smooth crystal floor where the ceremonial ring still rested, forgotten for the moment, yet somehow central to everything happening around it. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck again, a habit that had followed him through every uncomfortable moment of his life. I should probably warn you, he murmured quietly to Lysera. Humans are not known for starting new imperial traditions. We are usually just trying to survive awkward conversations. Lysera turned slightly toward him, and the faintest trace of amusement appeared again in her golden eyes. That may be precisely why the moment has value, she replied softly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Because it is awkward. Because it is honest. The princess looked back toward the gathered court, her voice calm, yet carrying easily across the chamber without effort. The Dominion has always valued strength, strategy, and stability, she said. Alliances are carefully negotiated. Futures are arranged through calculation. Her gaze moved across the advisors, the diplomats, and the nobles who had shaped the empire's decisions for generations. Yet strength can also come from something unexpected. A murmur moved through the court again, quieter this time, thoughtful rather than shocked. Ethan could feel the atmosphere changing, as if the room itself was adjusting to a possibility no one had planned for. Lysera stepped forward a single pace. The movement was small, but it shifted the entire focus of the chamber. For years the court has discussed which union would benefit the Dominion most, she continued. But the foundation of any alliance is trust. And trust cannot be negotiated by people who have never spoken freely to one another. Ethan felt several sets of eyes turn toward him again. That was not a comfortable experience. He was still wearing his engineering jacket, still had a small diagnostic scanner clipped to his belt, and suddenly looked very out of place in the center of an imperial court debate. Lysera glanced briefly toward the ceremonial ring on the floor, then back to Ethan. You explained that humans do not decide such matters quickly, she said quietly enough that only he could hear. Ethan nodded cautiously. That is correct. Usually it involves a lot of conversations, and probably some coffee. Coffee, Lysera repeated thoughtfully, as if cataloging an unfamiliar cultural concept. Then she lifted her voice again so the entire chamber could hear her. If the human custom requires time and understanding before such a vow can exist, then perhaps the Dominion should allow that process to begin rather than dismiss it. The elderly advisor studied her carefully. Princess Lysera, he said slowly, are you suggesting that the declaration remain under consideration rather than concluded? Lysera inclined her head. Precisely. Ethan blinked in surprise. That had not been the direction he expected this situation to go. The advisor turned toward Ethan. And you, Ethan Carter of Earth, would you accept such consideration? Ethan hesitated, realizing that every voice in the chamber had gone quiet again. He looked at Lysera, then back at the watching court. Finally, he said the only honest thing he could think of. I would be willing to have a conversation before anyone schedules a wedding. For a moment the chamber remained perfectly still after Ethan Carter finished speaking. The sentence he had just offered seemed almost absurd compared to the enormous traditions surrounding them. I would be willing to have a conversation before anyone schedules a wedding. Yet instead of laughter or outrage, the court reacted with something far more surprising. Thoughtful silence. The floating lanterns above drifted slowly across the high crystal ceiling, their pale violet light sliding over the kneeling nobles like moonlight over calm water. Ethan suddenly realized that every person in the hall was studying him again, not as a technician who had wandered into the wrong ceremony, but as someone who had introduced a completely unfamiliar concept into their traditions. A conversation. It sounded simple. On Earth it was how most decisions began. But here in the Dominion court the idea appeared almost revolutionary. The elderly advisor folded his long hands within the sleeves of his ceremonial robe and regarded Ethan carefully. The human proposes discussion before conclusion, he said quietly, repeating the idea as if testing how it felt in the language of the Dominion. Several advisors murmured softly among themselves. One noble tilted her head slightly, clearly intrigued. Another seemed uncertain whether the suggestion was bold or ridiculous. Ethan shifted his stance and tried to look less like a man who had accidentally walked into a royal history lesson with a toolbox still clipped to his belt. He glanced sideways at Lysera. The princess had not moved, but the calm confidence in her posture had grown stronger. Her golden eyes rested on the court with quiet authority, yet there was something warmer in her expression now when she looked back at Ethan. The advisor finally spoke again. Princess Lysera, the court must ask whether this proposal of conversation reflects your will. Lysera answered without hesitation. It does. A ripple of interest moved through the nobles. Ethan could almost feel the atmosphere shifting again, the way the air changes just before a storm becomes rain. Lysera stepped forward another small pace. The Dominion prides itself on wisdom, she continued clearly. Wisdom requires understanding. Understanding requires listening. She paused briefly, allowing the translation system to carry each word through the hall. If the human custom begins with conversation, then perhaps we should learn from that custom before deciding its value. Ethan felt the attention return to him again, though now it carried curiosity instead of tension. One of the younger advisors leaned forward slightly and addressed him directly. Ethan Carter of Earth, if such conversation were to occur, what would it involve? Ethan blinked once, surprised by the straightforward question. Honestly, he said slowly, it usually starts with something simple. Two people talk. They learn what the other person cares about. They discover whether they share the same values. Sometimes they realize they do. Sometimes they realize they do not. The advisor considered this carefully. And this process requires time. Yes, Ethan replied. Usually more than 7 minutes. A quiet ripple of restrained amusement moved through part of the court at that remark. Even the elderly advisor allowed a faint smile before returning to his thoughtful composure. Lysera looked at Ethan again, her expression thoughtful but calm. On your world, she asked softly, would such a conversation take place in a hall like this? Ethan shook his head immediately. Not unless someone made a very wrong reservation. Where then? Ethan considered for a moment before answering honestly. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere people can speak without an audience deciding the outcome before the conversation even begins. Lysera studied him for a second longer before turning back toward the court. Then perhaps that is where the Dominion should begin this moment. The chamber remained suspended in quiet anticipation after Princess Lysera's words settled across the hall. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere people can speak without an audience deciding the outcome before the conversation even begins. Ethan Carter could almost feel the weight of the moment shifting again, like the slow turning of a massive wheel that had not moved in centuries. The nobles who had been kneeling for so long finally began to rise carefully to their feet, not in disorder, but with deliberate grace, each movement respectful and measured. The ceremony had clearly moved beyond its original script. The elderly advisor studied the princess for several long seconds before speaking again. His voice carried the tone of someone navigating unfamiliar ground with great care. Princess Lysera, the Dominion court recognizes your authority to interpret ceremonial tradition. However, such a departure from precedent has never been attempted. Lysera inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the concern without retreating from her decision. That is precisely why it must be considered carefully, she replied calmly. The advisor nodded slowly, then turned toward Ethan once more. Ethan Carter of Earth, he said thoughtfully, you have introduced an unfamiliar idea into this hall. Your custom suggests that understanding must come before commitment. Ethan straightened a little under the attention, still feeling strangely out of place beneath the towering crystal arches. Yes, he said honestly. That is usually how we avoid making very large mistakes. A few quiet chuckles moved through the court, subtle but genuine. Even several of the advisors seemed to appreciate the straightforwardness of the human explanation. The advisor continued. If the Dominion were to allow such conversation, it would represent a pause in the ceremonial process. The declaration would remain acknowledged but unresolved until both individuals reach understanding. Ethan glanced toward Lysera again. The princess appeared thoughtful rather than nervous, as though the entire unfolding situation felt less like chaos and more like a door opening that had always been locked. The advisor finally looked between them both. The court must ask one final question before considering such an arrangement. His gaze returned to Ethan. Human engineer, do you understand that continuing this path means your presence in the Dominion court will no longer be that of a technician repairing equipment? Ethan exhaled quietly, realizing exactly where the conversation was going. You mean I accidentally applied for a much more complicated job? The advisor allowed a faint smile. Something like that. Ethan looked across the chamber once more. The nobles, the lanterns, the crystal pillars, the forgotten ceremonial ring glimmering on the floor. None of this belonged to his world, yet somehow he had become part of it. Then he looked back at Lysera. The calm intelligence in her golden eyes had not changed. She was not demanding anything from him. She was offering the same thing she had asked the court to consider. A choice. Ethan nodded slowly. I understand. Lysera stepped forward again, her voice steady as she addressed the court. Then the Dominion may witness the first conversation that was not arranged in advance. The advisor turned slightly toward the gathered nobles. The court will recess while this discussion takes place. When it resumes, the future of this declaration will be decided not by assumption but by understanding. As the nobles began to move quietly across the chamber, Ethan leaned slightly toward Lysera and spoke under his breath. Just so you know, where I come from, a first conversation usually starts with something simple. Lysera glanced toward him with quiet curiosity. Such as? Ethan allowed a small smile. Usually we begin with asking someone their favorite drink. The massive chamber slowly emptied with the quiet elegance of a ritual ending mid-sentence. Nobles moved in measured silence beneath the towering crystal pillars, their long ceremonial robes brushing across the polished floor as they departed in small clusters of whispering advisors and diplomats. The floating lanterns drifted lazily near the 70-foot ceiling, their violet glow reflecting off the translucent walls like distant stars. Within a few minutes, the hall that had been filled with hundreds of witnesses felt almost strangely calm. Ethan Carter stood in the middle of it all with the uneasy awareness that he had somehow become part of a moment the Dominion court would probably discuss for the next 100 years. He exhaled slowly and glanced down at the ceremonial ring still resting on the floor between them. That thing is still there, he said quietly, pointing toward it. Lysera followed his gaze for a moment before walking forward and bending gracefully to lift the ring from the crystal surface. Up close, the band shimmered with delicate patterns of silver and pale blue light, the craftsmanship far more intricate than anything Ethan had seen in human jewelry. She held it thoughtfully for a second before placing it back onto the pedestal from which it had fallen earlier. The movement felt symbolic even if neither of them spoke about it. Ethan shifted his weight and looked around the now nearly empty chamber. Only a few attendants remained at the far edges of the hall, giving the pair respectful distance. The quiet was so complete that Ethan could hear the faint hum of the palace ventilation system hidden somewhere within the crystal walls. Well, he said after a moment, this is definitely the most unusual first conversation setting I have ever experienced. Lysera turned toward him again, her expression thoughtful but calm. You mentioned a question earlier, she said. Ethan blinked. A question? Yes. He smiled slightly. Where I come from, when two people want to get to know each other, the first thing someone usually asks is a simple one. Lysera tilted her head with quiet curiosity. What question? Ethan folded his arms loosely and leaned against the side of the pedestal. It usually begins with something like this. He paused for a moment, then asked with an easy tone that felt far more natural than anything that had happened in the last half hour. What is your favorite drink? Lysera considered the question as if it were unexpectedly complex. The Dominion has many ceremonial beverages, she replied. Some are reserved for diplomatic gatherings, others for family celebrations. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. On Earth, the answer usually tells you something about the person. Coffee means they probably work too much. Tea means they are calm. Soda usually means they never grew out of childhood. For the first time since the ceremony began, Lysera allowed a small, genuine laugh to escape. The sound echoed softly through the crystal hall like a note of music that had never been played there before. Ethan smiled slightly at the reaction. So, he said, which category do you fall into? Lysera studied him for a moment before answering. I would like to try this coffee you mentioned. Ethan chuckled quietly. That can definitely be arranged. Then he glanced around the enormous chamber once more and added with a half-amused sigh. Though I have a feeling the palace might expect something slightly more formal than a coffee shop. Lysera's golden eyes brightened with quiet curiosity. Then perhaps we should introduce the Dominion to that tradition as well. The idea of introducing the Dominion court to coffee lingered in the quiet crystal hall like an oddly hopeful possibility. Ethan Carter leaned lightly against the pedestal and studied Princess Lysera for a moment, realizing that the atmosphere around them had changed in a way he could not quite explain. 30 minutes ago the room had been filled with rigid ceremony and political expectation. Now the massive chamber felt almost relaxed, as if the palace itself was curious about what would happen next. Lysera walked slowly toward the tall windows lining one side of the hall. The transparent crystal panels stretched nearly 30 feet high, revealing a sweeping view of the capital city beyond. Towering structures of glass and light curved upward toward a twilight sky, where distant air transports moved silently between glowing platforms. Ethan followed a few steps behind, taking in the view with quiet appreciation. That is a pretty impressive skyline, he said. Lysera rested her hand lightly against the crystal window frame. The capital has grown for thousands of years, she replied softly. Each generation adds something new while preserving what came before. Ethan nodded. On Earth we usually replace everything every few decades. New buildings, new technology, new trends. Sometimes we forget what the old ones meant. Lysera turned toward him again, her expression thoughtful. That is one of the differences between our cultures that interests me. Ethan smiled slightly. Only one. I am sure there are a few hundred more waiting to surprise both of us. Lysera seemed to consider that carefully before speaking again. When you suggested conversation earlier, she said, you described it as a process of learning what another person values. Ethan nodded. Exactly. It is not about impressing someone. It is about understanding who they really are when the audience disappears. Lysera glanced briefly toward the now empty ceremonial floor where the nobles had stood earlier. The audience has certainly disappeared, she said quietly. Ethan followed her gaze. The massive hall was now nearly silent except for the distant hum of the palace systems and the slow drifting lanterns above. It felt strange that such an enormous decision had paused in such a peaceful moment. Lysera turned back to him with quiet curiosity. Then perhaps we should begin this process properly. Ethan crossed his arms loosely, comfortable now in a way he had not expected. All right, he said. If we are starting an honest conversation, then we should probably follow the same rules humans use. Lysera tilted her head slightly. Which rules? Ethan raised a finger as if outlining a simple list. First rule. No titles for a while. Titles make people careful instead of honest. Lysera seemed intrigued by the idea. You would prefer that I not be addressed as princess? Ethan nodded. Just Lysera works for me. She considered that for a moment before responding calmly. Then you must also stop calling yourself an engineer of Earth and simply be Ethan. Ethan smiled. Deal. Lysera's golden eyes brightened slightly, as though the small agreement carried more meaning than the court might have expected. And the next rule? Ethan asked. Lysera paused thoughtfully before answering. The next rule is that you must actually introduce me to this coffee you promised. Ethan laughed quietly, the sound echoing gently through the towering hall. That might be the easiest diplomatic agreement this palace has ever made. The quiet laughter from Ethan Carter slowly faded into the vast crystal hall, leaving behind a calm that felt entirely different from the tension that had filled the chamber earlier. For the first time since the ceremony began, the space no longer felt like a stage for political theater. It felt almost ordinary. Lysera stood beside the towering window, her reflection faintly visible in the translucent surface of the crystal wall, while the glowing skyline of the Dominion capital stretched far into the horizon. Ethan stepped closer to the window and folded his arms loosely, studying the endless towers of light and glass that curved across the alien city. From this height, the air transports looked like drifting sparks, moving quietly between landing platforms hundreds of feet above the streets below. That city probably has millions of stories happening at the same time right now, he said thoughtfully. Lysera followed his gaze across the skyline. The capital contains nearly 12 million residents, she replied calmly. Ethan nodded slowly. That sounds about right. Where I grew up, cities are the same. Everyone walking past each other, each person dealing with their own complicated life. Sometimes they collide in ways nobody planned. Lysera turned slightly toward him. Much like what happened in this hall today. Ethan smiled. Exactly like that. For a moment, they both looked back toward the empty ceremonial floor behind them. The towering pillars, the glowing lanterns, and the polished crystal surface were all exactly the same as before. Yet somehow the atmosphere had changed completely. Earlier the hall had felt like a machine built from tradition and expectation. Now it felt like a quiet pause before something new began. Lysera studied the room thoughtfully. The Dominion Court will return soon, she said softly. When they do, they will expect an answer about what this moment means. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, I figured that part was coming. He ran a hand through his hair and looked back toward the city lights again. You know, on Earth there is a saying. Lysera waited with quiet curiosity. Ethan continued. Sometimes the most important decisions in life begin with something completely accidental. Lysera considered that for a moment. In the Dominion, we usually try very hard to avoid accidents. Ethan chuckled quietly. Trust me, humans try too. We just fail at it more often. Lysera stepped away from the window and walked back toward the center of the hall where the ceremonial pedestal still stood. The silver ring rested there once again, catching the soft lantern light like a tiny star waiting for someone to decide its purpose. She studied it for a moment before speaking again. Earlier you said that a conversation is how humans discover whether they share the same values. Ethan nodded. That is the idea. Lysera turned back toward him. Then perhaps the most important question has not yet been asked. Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. Which question is that? Lysera's golden eyes held as calmly, thoughtful but steady. After our conversation, Ethan Carter, if the answer is yes, would you still consider the proposal you joked about earlier? Ethan looked at the ring, then back at her, and for the first time since this entire situation began he realized something surprising. He was not thinking about the court, the ceremony, or the accidental declaration anymore. He was thinking about the conversation they had just begun. He smiled slightly and answered with quiet honesty. That depends on how good the coffee is.